Hello, this is Professor James Strickler. This is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 8 about civil liberties. It's Lesson 12 about past substantive due process. In this lesson, you'll learn about the case of Dred Scott versus Sandford, the case of Lochner versus New York, about liberty of contract, the case of NEBBIA versus New York, and about Lochnerizing. In previous lessons, you've learned about the power that the United States Supreme Court possesses to, through its decisions, create, define, and even destroy constitutional rights. One of the primary ways that they accomplish this that we've discussed in previous lessons is the doctrine of selective incorporation. As we've discussed selective incorporation, you've learned that there are two kinds of due process that are involved in this. The first is what we call procedural due process. That's where the court borrows ideas from the Bill of Rights, reads them into the 14th Amendment, that's what selective incorporation is, but they're specifically looking for things that will inform them of what sort of procedures need to be followed in order for a state to take people's life, liberty, or property away. The other kind of due process, which has become known as substantive due process, concerns not the procedures that need to be followed to take someone's life, liberty, or property away, but the things that are being taken away, specifically things that can be read into that word liberty. This allows the court to then borrow ideas from elsewhere, read them into the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, and force states to respect those rights, whatever they may be also. Substantive due process then is divided into two categories. One of those is what we call textual substantive due process. This is where the ideas that the court is reading into the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause are borrowed from the text elsewhere in the Constitution, particularly the Bill of Rights, and that, most particularly, the First Amendment. So we get things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, being read into the word liberty in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment to force states to then not take those liberties away either. The last category of substantive due process we call non-textual substantive due process. This is where the Supreme Court is claiming that some right exists that the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment requires that states honor, without being able to point anywhere else in the Constitution and say that's where they got the idea from. Essentially, at this point, the court is arguably just making stuff up. I'm going to talk to you then in this lesson about a couple of examples of the court engaging in non-textual substantive due process much earlier in our country's history. The first of these is the case of Dred Scott versus Sandford. This is one of the most famous cases in Supreme Court history. Now, this case occurred before the American Civil War. So it was before the 14th Amendment was added to the Constitution. Well, then how can it be a substantive due process case? Because there is another due process clause in the Constitution, the Fifth Amendment. And in this case, the United States Supreme Court took a substantive due process approach to that amendment. This is arguably the first example of the United States Supreme Court engaging in substantive due process. What happened in this case was there was a man named Dred Scott who was a slave. Although he was a slave, he didn't really think of himself as a slave. He was an assistant to a surgeon. The surgeon was his owner officially, but he was friends with the family. When the surgeon joined the Army and was sent to a military base in Wisconsin, Dred Scott packed up and moved with him from Missouri, a slave state, to Wisconsin, which was part of the territory which was administered by the national government. It was not part of any state. And under a national law at the time, slavery was illegal in this territory. But Dred Scott as a slave went there anyway with his master because he was his surgical assistant. He was a surgeon. After the master finished his service in the military, he then moved back to Missouri, and Dred Scott went with him. The man then died, and the widow remarried. And the new husband decided that they didn't really have a use for Dred Scott then, and that they should sell him. That's the SANDFORD in the case title. But then at that point, Dred Scott made a powerful argument. He said, wait a minute. I went to live freely. My master took me there. I went to live in a place in the country where slavery is illegal. Therefore, while I was there, I must not have been a slave. And if I then was not a slave, when I came back to Missouri, I came back as a free man, which means I'm not a slave now for you to sell. You can't sell me. That argument then was made in court. Eventually, it was appealed all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And when the United States Supreme Court figured out a way to settle this issue, to decide whether Dred Scott was free because he had gone to the territory of Wisconsin where slavery was illegal, they relied upon substantive, non-textual, substantive due process to reach a decision in the case. Here's what they actually said. They said that an act of Congress that takes somebody's property away just simply because they went into a particular place where that property is illegal, in the opinion of the court, cannot be dignified with the name due process of law. Now notice in making this claim that taking somebody's property away just because they crossed a boundary to where the thing is illegal is not due process, they actually aren't arguing about any of the process that took place. It's not an issue about whether or not there was a fair trial to decide whether he was a slave, whether he got to present proper evidence, things like that. Instead, it's a question of the substance of the law. Should you be able to take somebody's property away, regardless of what procedure you go through? So this is an example, as we've talked about in a previous lesson in the course, of them taking the due process clause, which is about procedure, and instead using it to evaluate the substance of a law. And in this case, declare essentially a right to have a slave. To say that the government can't take your slave away from you simply by making it slavery illegal in a place that then you cross into. Well, the Dred Scott decision, which left Dred Scott as a slave, became known eventually as one of the worst decisions in Supreme Court history, and there's multiple reasons for this. There's parts of it that I haven't even mentioned that are even worse than the part that I am mentioning in this lesson. But it's bad for one reason that we've already talked about, this notion of non-textual substantive due process, and using it to assert the right to this property no matter where you go with it. Now think how absurd this notion is. If you were to get on a plane and fly to Colorado where marijuana is legal, and you were to purchase some weed there and then fly back to some other state where it's illegal, and you got off the plane and a police officer caught you with the marijuana, it would do you no good whatsoever to make the argument, well, I had it before in a place that was legal, and you can't say it's now illegal just because I crossed a boundary here. You can't take it away from me just because I went someplace else. According to Dred Scott, that can't be dignified with due process of law. That's the argument you're making, and it's an absurd argument. If you couldn't make things illegal just because somebody crossed a boundary with them, then basically people could take anything anywhere in the country they wanted. If a rocket launcher was legal in Texas, and then a person could pack up and move with it to California where it's illegal, and they would get to keep it. So basically everyone would just go buy stuff where it's legal and take it places where it's illegal. That obviously is an absurd outcome, so that can't be the correct reasoning. But that is the reasoning they used in this case. That's one of the reasons why it's considered such a bad decision. Well, eventually this decision was overruled by the end of the American Civil War, by the freeing of the slaves through the 13th Amendment. So at that point, whether Dred Scott was a slave or not was irrelevant because the 13th Amendment had ended slavery. So that was America's first big experiment with this idea of substantive due process, and it was a bad one. The next experiment was in a case, Lochner versus New York, which came about 50 years later. Lochner was a bakery owner. He wanted his employees to work longer hours. They wanted to work longer hours. They wanted to get the overtime pay. But there was a law in New York at the time that limited the number of hours that bakery workers could work. Well, the workers worked longer than they were supposed to. They got caught. They got fined by the state of New York. Well, Lochner challenged the fine, and the case eventually ended up in the United States Supreme Court. And the United States Supreme Court ended up ruling in Lochner's favor. Now, the way that they ruled in Lochner's favor was to say that a right to enter a contract, in this case the employer to contract with the employee to work a certain number of hours, the court claims is a part of that word liberty in the 14th Amendment. See how this is obviously a substantive due process case, but it's a non-textual one because there's no right to contract listed anywhere else in the Constitution. Well, once they decide that there's this right to contract in the 14th Amendment, the court then reasons that, in their opinion, there's no reasonable ground to interfere with it, particularly in a case like this. This is the beginning, then, of the Supreme Court espousing a doctrine based on this notion of non-textual substantive due process that's become known as liberty of contract. Now, discovering a liberty of contract, basically a claim that the Constitution protects people to enter into any business arrangement they want. This allowed the Supreme Court to invalidate any law that they simply disliked. If they thought the law was okay, they just left it alone. If they didn't like it, they would say, oh, that violates liberty of contract, and they would strike it down. This put the Supreme Court in the place of having a veto over every economic law being passed in the United States of America. Now, many observers at the court of this time thought that that was a bit extreme, that turning that level of power over to the Supreme Court was unwarranted and even harmful. And eventually the court itself agreed. In a later case, NEBBIA versus New York, about a man who was selling milk below the price that was mandated by the state, the Supreme Court ended up overruling its opinion in Lochner. In NEBBIA, they said that the Constitution does not guarantee that you can enter into whatever business arrangement you want. Instead, the states can regulate what sort of economic activities you engage in as part of their police powers. And the courts have no authority to interfere with that. So there was this brief time where Lochner was the standard, and there was supposedly this non-textual substantive due process right to enter into any contract you want. But within a couple of decades, the Supreme Court had changed its mind, decided that was a bad idea, and stopped doing that sort of thing. So the Supreme Court's use of non-textual substantive due process, like in cases such as Lochner, was once again discredited, as it had been in the Dred Scott case. After it was discredited, the Lochner case became another case with a very bad reputation. So much so that any time the Supreme Court seemed to be engaged in substituting its policy preferences for those of a legislature, the court would be accused of Lochnerizing. So between these two cases, Dred Scott and Lochner, we had two occasions where the Supreme Court tried to engage in this non-textual substantive due process and then ended up rejecting it. This then was the legacy of non-textual substantive due process up until the 1960s. It was considered an inappropriate thing for the courts to do on the rare occasion when they had done it. Now let's review what we learned in this lesson. What non-textual right was discovered in the Dred Scott case? Was it to own a slave, enter a business contract, purchase birth control, or have a same-sex marriage? The non-textual right discovered in Dred Scott was the right to own a slave. What non-textual right was discovered in the Lochner case? Was it to own a slave, enter a business contract, or purchase birth control, or enter a same-sex marriage? It was to enter a business contract. What right did the NEBBIA case eliminate? Was it the freedom to own a slave, liberty of contract, right to privacy, or equal protection of the law? The NEBBIA case ended this notion of liberty of contract, which had been given birth in the Lochner case. And lastly, what does it mean if a court Lochnerizes? Does it mean that it closes down a business, or it imposes enslavement of some group, or that it helps industrial workers? Or does it mean that it substitutes its own policy ideas for those of the law passed by a legislature? Lochnerizing means that the court is substituting its ideas, its policy preferences, for what the law should be, for what the law is. That completes this lesson. The next lesson, also from Unit 8, will be Lesson 13, another lesson about non-textual substantive due process, in particular something called the right to privacy.